Hey everybody, this is lecture 6 on theoretical perspectives, feminism, and making sense of competing perspectives. This is for POS 273, International Relations, an online undergraduate course taught at the University of Maine. I'm Rob Glover, the instructor. Okay, so today we wrap up with these different theoretical perspectives in international relations that we've been talking about. Looking finally at feminism, feminist IR theory. So like we've been doing, we'll ask what are the basic assumptions of feminist IR theory? What are the implications for a feminist worldview of international relations? And then we'll kind of delve into the theory itself and how one's perspective on important international issues might be altered by greater attention to the feminist perspective and just gender issues generally. And we'll close, kind of round out this, this extended section on IR theory by talking about how we can make sense of these different theoretical perspectives, and really the key reason why we focus on theory. How do we utilize them? What's some advice for how to utilize these theories to make sense of international relations? So in that we're only looking at one theoretical perspective today, this will probably be a little bit of a shorter lecture than some of the others, but nonetheless very, very important. Feminism and feminist theory is increasingly important to understand international relations. So what are some of its basic assumptions? Feminist IR theory talks about gender as a social construction. And now that you've had the lecture on constructivism, you know what a social construction means. This is something that acquires value or power or importance simply through social interaction. It doesn't have any inherent value, but through our repeated social interactions, the expectations that we create around certain ideas or certain concepts, they acquire this ideational value. And gender is no exception. There is a distinction made in feminist theory that you've probably encountered if you've taken a women's studies class or even kind of social psychology. We talk about this a lot. There's a distinction made between biological sex and gender. So biological sex, you know, you're a man or a woman, and gender, which is a set of social norms and expectations associated with one's sex, right? So masculine or feminine. And there's nothing inherent about our biological sex that pushes us to adopt certain gender characteristics or gender traits, or to define certain activities along lines of gender associated with masculinity or femininity. Nothing biologically drives us in that direction, according to feminist IR theory. This is something that is socially created and then socially reinforced. Okay, so that's an important distinction that will become very important as you begin to analyze how feminist IR theory kind of operates and how they try to make sense of international relations. They argue that we have these kind of gendered assumptions and actions which shape behavior in international relations. So because we assign certain qualities or characteristics to certain activities, and those have a gendered character to them, certain things are masculine or feminine, that has significant implications for how we behave in every aspect of our lives, you know, in the home or in the workplace or in society, but that extends to international relations. Those gendered assumptions carry over into the international realm. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and you'll get a sense of how that operates in international relations. Lastly, a question that frequently comes up in feminist IR theory and feminist analysis of international relations is, where are the women? One of the kind of initial steps in looking at international relations through a feminist lens is to simply look at the dominant accounts of things that are unfolding, stories that we're being told, issues in the media, the discourse around certain international issues, and to say, okay, you know, where are the women in this narrative? And if they're not there, why are they not there? And if they are there, what sorts of characteristics, what sorts of norms and expectations are being put on display, made evident through how women are discussed in relation to international relations. They make the case that often the experiences of women are not highlighted, right? Sometimes they're just simply absent. Sometimes the question of where are the women is, you ask that question because there are none in a given account of an international issue or an international event. But when they are there, that's equally interesting because oftentimes they're presented or misrepresented in various ways. There are generalizations made, there are stereotypes made. It's often the women that are not shaping their own narrative. It's a story being told about them, and there's some symbolic value attached to women. And again, as we go through how to apply feminist hierarchy theory, we'll talk about this in more detail and you'll see some examples. Okay, so those are our basic assumptions. What are the implications for a feminist worldview? Well, the first thing I'll say is that there is no feminist worldview. There is no singular feminist worldview. The chapter that you read, well, not even a chapter, a short section of a chapter, about 6 pages, that you read for today, for this module, talks about these different variants of feminist theory. They talk about standpoint feminism and liberal feminism and Marxist feminism, post-colonial feminism. I don't get into those distinctions because I think they're kind of imperfect and they're complex, and they make things, it's good if you want to go on and study feminist theory in more detail to know something about those distinctions, but I'm focused on kind of the broad overview of feminist theory and how feminist theory is used in IR, and I don't necessarily want to get bogged down in the semantics, the difference between a standpoint feminist and a post-colonial feminist. So I don't go into those distinctions, and I don't expect you to know those for the exam or anything. But the one thing that I would point out, the really important caveat when you're dealing with feminist theory, is that there are debates internal to feminist scholars and feminist theory. There is not a singular feminist worldview. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of contentious debate over gender and the role of gender in society and in the world, and we shouldn't gloss over that, and we shouldn't paint feminism as kind of a singular view. But I do think there are some commonalities that any feminist perspective we'd see something like this. The first is that gendered construction of knowledge shapes how we view what is important and relevant in international relations, and then how we define and map out those areas of importance, right? So the issues that we decide are most essential, security, trade, economic development, these things reflect a certain construction of knowledge that is heavily gendered. And then once we define those issues and we start to talk about them, the way that we define them and the way that we map out those areas of importance oftentimes has a gendered perspective. Women are painted in certain ways, they are portrayed in certain ways, they play certain roles in the stories that we tell ourselves about international relations and the way we frame that discourse that come back to that gender distinction between masculine and feminine, and all of the social baggage, all of the norms, all of the expectations that accompany that. Okay. Along those same lines, the second implication is that women and gender have been constructed to serve certain interests and serve certain agendas in international relations. And so a key task of feminist analysis is to unpack that, is to kind of deconstruct those roles and those interests and those agendas and look at the way that women and gender are being portrayed and try to figure out why that happened and try to trace this, genealogical process by which women and gender figured into a certain issue and began to be discussed in certain ways. And then lastly, the last implication is that women have knowledge and perspectives and experiences that should be brought to bear on the study of international relations. And too often that's not the case. Too often people in positions of power speak for women, or even women in positions of power speak for women with less power. And the goal really should be for women to be allowed to define their experiences and their demands in their own terms, to the extent that it's possible. Sometimes it's very, very hard, particularly women who are being oppressed or women who are being deprived of rights. So if we're talking about female genital mutilation in a developing country in which women don't necessarily have access to a platform to voice their views or state in their own terms what they want, then sometimes it's really hard to get the actual kind of firsthand experience of women. But we should try. We should seek it out, and we should try as best we can to understand the experiences of women throughout the world in conditions of war, or how they're affected by economic processes, how they're affected by the environment, how the role that they play in relation to their country's economic development. We should try to find those perspectives of women and allow them to define those experiences and what they want, what their interests are, what their demands are in their own terms, to the extent that we can. Which is a challenging process, right? It is often a very challenging process to get at that perspective of women in certain situations, particularly when we're dealing with, war or human rights violations, things like that. It can be challenging to get the perspective of any group that is marginalized and deprived of rights. The one other thing that I'll add here is that though we talk about the feminist worldview often in terms of gender, in terms of the distinction between masculine and feminine, men and women, feminist IR theory is not limited to trying to advance the cause of women or bring to light the knowledge and perspectives and experiences of women, particularly standpoint feminism. The theory of standpoint feminism really highlights any marginalized identity. There's always kind of a dominant identity, and then there's a series of identities that are under the surface or misrepresented or not allowed to kind of voice themselves in their own terms. And a lot of the feminist worldview is about uncovering those marginalized or repressed voices and unpacking, kind of disentangling the dominant voice, whatever the dominant voice or dominant perspective on a given issue is. Really just kind of critiquing and articulating the ways in which power silences certain perspectives and trying to give those perspectives voice. So it's not limited to just gender, although you might think that because of some of the terminology that's used. Okay. So we said that a key question that feminist IR theorists are going to ask is, where are the women? And they make the case that often women are either completely absent from discussion of international issues, or they are discussed according to these overdetermined, kind of super generalized gender roles that they didn't necessarily have a hand in defining. It's not, women are defining themselves in this way. It's some other entity in a position of power is saying this is the condition of women here. And they're being used kind of symbolically in certain ways. Women are used in all sorts of different ways to advance political agendas and to advance policy actions, right? Things are done on behalf of women, but the women aren't necessarily allowed to speak or articulate their perspective. So I just wanted to give you some examples, kind of concrete examples of the types of things that feminist IR theorists would be talking about. Women, particularly in relation to security, women are, that's a good issue in which sometimes analyses are just kind of, women drop out of the picture, and the unique experiences of women are not discussed. So if we're talking about a civil war or a conflict situation or foreign intervention in which the United States is going to go in some place and try to rectify some security situation, and they're going to send in the military. That's an instance in which either women kind of drop out of the picture, or they're used symbolically in certain ways that might not represent their own perspectives. If you were to give women a voice and say, what is it that you want? What is it that you need? They might not have that perspective. So a few examples with some visuals to help here. This is a recruitment poster, I believe, from the early to mid part of the 20th century. I think it would have been either the First or the Second World War, but it's a recruitment poster for the United States Army. And this is an instance in which women are absent entirely. The poster says that the United States Army builds men, and men is in all caps, and it is underlined. And then you see these kind of iconic figures of men and character and crafts and physique, and then you see a combat soldier looking out at the world, right? And women in this picture, they're just kind of absent. They're not there. And that oftentimes happens in discussions of security, is that the whole character of the conversation about a security issue disregards the very important role that women can play in conflict situations, or women can play even a societal role in relation to conflict. The sacrifices made by mothers and wives in order to enable conflict action and a military force to deploy, and then the subsequent actions that they are forced to take on when those troops come home and they're either suffering from PTSD, or they've been injured, or can't immediately transition into the workforce, the economic sacrifice that takes place. There's also no discussion of victims here. There's no discussion of when the army is deployed. Oftentimes that can result in a destabilizing situation somewhere else. And so what does that mean for women on the ground somewhere else where that conflict action is taking place? So this is an instance in which women are kind of absent entirely from the picture. We also frequently see women presented as these kind of defenseless, helpless, innocent victims, oftentimes alongside children. And this is an example, right? This is a woman in the developing world, and there's a small child, and you see this kind of look of despair and suffering on her face. And that's a very important symbolic way in which women are represented in discussion of intervention or foreign aid, economic development. It's like, the country is suffering, and women are, being oppressed in some way, or they can't provide for themselves. So women as helpless, innocent victims is another way in which it doesn't necessarily correspond with how women view themselves in those areas, but it's frequently articulated as a justification for something, for some sort of policy action. And a feminist IR theorist would zoom right in on that and say, okay, what are the actual perspectives of women on the ground, and do they want this foreign policy action? What do they need? What are their hopes and desires? Can we get into the actual lives and perspectives of women and try and represent them more authentically, rather than assuming that they're helpless or defenseless against whatever's going on in their country? Then lastly, again, a very important symbolic role is women in traditional nurturing roles. And granted, this is sort of dated. I believe this is from World War II, a recruitment poster, not for soldiers, not for men to go off and join a fighting force, but for women to perform their duty, which is a traditional nurturing role. Nurses, right, we think of as providing care, and it's a very gendered expectation. You look at most nursing programs, it's overwhelmingly female. There's this kind of cultural baggage associated with nursing and the profession of nursing. When you talk to most nurses too, I come from a family of nurses, and they say, oh yeah, we desperately need male nurses. We wish there were more male nurses, because sometimes the job is so physically demanding that you just need somebody that has more physical strength than women typically have. And so male nurses are in high demand. But traditionally, we have associated that with women, and it's one of these kind of traditional nurturing roles. So here we see that on full display, and that reflects something, that's symbolic of something, that a woman's role is not necessarily these expectations that we've associated with masculinity, fighting, and being part of the fighting force. It's providing care and comfort and acting in this nurturing role. So these things, I mean, it seems like it might seem like this is unimportant, but a feminist IR theorist or a feminist analysis of IR would say, no, this is crucially important. It's essential that we unpack these gendered assumptions, because these things have real impacts on policy. They have real impacts on the way that women are perceived when they enter into non-traditional roles. Remember when we talked about social construction and we said, if you want to expose something that is a social construction, you want to kind of toy with a social construction, break the norm associated with the social construction, and you'll see the way that society reacts. And they might not react in a way that's particularly welcoming to this different or novel role or action. And that is certainly the case with gender roles and gendered expectations around certain types of activities, is that when those norms are broken, there's real kind of suffering that can occur for the people that choose to break them, or the people that strive to be something different rather than what they are socially conditioned to be in their society. So feminist IR theorist or a feminist analysis of IR would say this is really, really important stuff. It's foundational and it shapes everything that occurs subsequently. Now, it's not to say that there aren't women in positions of power in not only within domestic politics, but within international politics. And here is a sampling of some incredibly powerful women. Golda Meir, who is the Prime Minister of Israel in the 1970s, Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State and is gearing up for a run for the presidency, Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of the UK for over a decade, and then lastly Condoleezza Rice, who served as both Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. So these are important women in positions of incredible power, and all of them having an impact on international relations, and by and large, being respected as really kind of accomplished and savvy and smart practitioners of foreign policy and international politics. These are people not to be toyed with, and they, play that role well. They earn the respect of their peers. So it's not to say that there aren't women in positions of power. There are, and those numbers are increasing, perhaps a little bit slower than some of us would like, but women achieve positions of power. But a feminist theorist or a feminist analyst would look at this and say, okay, but what are the perceptions that revolve around powerful women in international relations, and how are they potentially different than perceptions of men in positions of power in international relations? And that's where it's really significant. It's very easy to see how the standards and the expectations are different. And many of these women will talk candidly about how there's a different set of expectations for a woman, and it's something that you have to adjust to. All of these women, at times, for doing things that we might not hesitate to see a man do, for kind of forcefully asserting their power or being very forthright in their demands and expectations. All of these women have been presented as just kind of in not the most favorable terms. All of these women are very controversial, and their critics paint them in ways that are not flattering for doing things that we might respect if it were a man. For being kind of bossy and assertive and not taking no for an answer, and they get described as cold and calculating and ruthless and all sorts of terrible things, right? Words I won't even say. And women in positions of power and feminist IR analysts would say that's a a problematic double standard. You know, if a woman, in order to succeed, has to adhere to a certain set of gendered expectations about how one behaves and the types of action one engages in, and the forceful way in which one must assert themselves, and then by playing the rules of the game becomes open to a whole series of criticisms that are not leveled in the same way at men, then that says something really fundamental about the way that we construct expectations in in a completely unfair way, in a completely dualistic way, in which women have a harder set of obligations and expectations to fulfill, and then when they fulfill them well, they are criticized relentlessly for doing so. And these four women and many other women would be examples of that. So that would be an interesting subject of feminist analysis, is just to look at media coverage of women in positions of power and how it differs from men. One little anecdote, I remember this from when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. She was in an interview, and she was asked, while she was Secretary of State, she had one of the most intense travel schedules of any Secretary of State in history. She went to something like 170 countries in 120 days or something like that. So just an incredibly intense schedule. And there was an interviewer asking her about the difficulty of making fashion choices. You're in so many different places, and you don't want to just wear the same thing all the time. And does it become complicated to figure out what you're going to wear and when, and just to keep track of all those different outfits when you're traveling around the world like this? And Hillary Clinton was kind of taken aback. She just said, "Would you have asked that question if I were a man?" And the interviewer, quite honestly, said, "No, I guess I wouldn't have." Right? But that was an instance in which the interviewer was kind of shocked that they had even asked the question, because they hadn't really thought about it. It just seemed like a natural question to ask a woman who was in this position of power and traveling on such a regular basis. And then Hillary Clinton turned it around and said, maybe there's some sort of gendered assumptions that you're making when you ask the Secretary of State of the most powerful country in the world a question like that, and was kind of reticent about having asked the question in the first place. But again, it's an example of the ways in which we have certain assumptions about gender that then carry over to perceptions not just of average, ordinary women, and not of women who are suffering in conflict situations or deprived of rights, but some of the most powerful foreign policy leaders in the world. So something to think about, and certainly a subject for plenty of analysis in addition to the analysis which has already occurred. All right, so there's a clip here from Cynthia Enloe. Cynthia Enloe is a international relations theorist, feminist theorist. She works out of Clark University in Massachusetts, and she wrote a couple very famous books looking at gender and international relations, one of which is called Bananas, Beaches, and Bases. And you might have been exposed to it. It's a pretty common text for, again, women's studies or any sort of course on international women's issues. So if you've taken a course like that, you might have, even if you were just exposed to an excerpt of it. But she has made her career really looking at the intersection of feminism and gender and international relations. And here, this was done, I believe, in the mid-2000s. She was talking about Afghanistan, the U.S. war in Afghanistan, at a time in which it was ongoing, and trying to apply some of these feminist notions of gendered constructions, gendered understandings, to how we were talking about Afghanistan at that time. So I'll just play this clip. It's relatively short. It's about 4 minutes, and then talk a little bit about it, because I think it's a very good example of how feminist IR theory can help us understand international issues in a completely different light. Okay.
I think one of the things we really need to all do internationally and in the U.S. is we need to really think seriously about what we can learn from Afghan feminists. That the women in RAWA, which is the Revolutionary Association of Afghan Women, or the RAWA, right? They've been thinking about what a new government in Afghanistan might be like. They're trying to think about what it means to have a secular state, which allows for freedom of religion, but is secular in its use of state authority. They've been trying to think about how women's literacy is crucial to democracy, how women's health care is absolutely essential for women being able to live the life of full citizenship. And I try a lot, I mean, I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, but I've been trying a lot to listen wherever I can to the expressions of Afghan women, many of whom are in exile, but some of whom are working underground in the refugee camps in Pakistan and still in Afghanistan itself. But here's the caveat, and it's a really important caveat, I think, that we all need to take on board. One of the things we've learned from feminists in other countries is that sometimes the militarizers, who can be the media or the intellectual elite or government officials, sometimes the militarizers will adopt, in the worst sense, not the best sense, will adopt women's rights to justify their militarized response. And we can see that happening in the United States. That is, that our government and the media and intellectuals and even people who tell jokes, all the jokes about bin Laden coming back as a woman, right? As if that's the ultimate revenge. And everyone who tells those jokes, they've all of a sudden take on board that the conditions of Afghan women are important. They're important to joke about, they're important to use in formal speeches, they're important to make asides to or to show images of in the nightly news, as if all of a sudden Afghan women's condition is something we all care about. And that makes me very nervous because I think it's being used to justify our military response without ever asking any of the Afghan feminists actually what they think. And that's the militarization of women's rights. To use women's alleged, benighted, deprived situation in one country to make us feel more civilized and therefore more justified in taking whatever actions we come up with in the name of their liberation. Whereas what feminists have taught us, and this is now over the last 150 years, at least since the 1850s, is that if one really cares about women's rights in another community, in another ethnic group, or in another country, then the first thing you do because you care is you start listening and you start affecting your own behavior by what you hear from those women because they're smart. To be deprived of rights doesn't mean you're foolish or uneducated. To be deprived of rights means just that, you're deprived of rights. So the first thing that needs to happen, if anyone says they care about Afghan women's condition, is make sure that they're part of the rebuilding of Afghanistan. And second of all, stop the bombing immediately until you ask those women whether they thought bombing was the best way to improve their conditions in the world.
Okay, so clearly there, Cynthia Enloe is talking about some of the things that we mentioned in the overview of feminist IR theory. She was talking about these gendered assumptions that we have about women, right, and the way that women symbolically were utilized in the rhetoric around the war in Afghanistan as a justification for war, right? We had to go in and remove the Taliban, this oppressive extremist regime with a very, very fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, because they were depriving of education to women and girls, and that was problematic. Which undoubtedly, as Enloe said, was something that the feminists within Afghanistan would have agreed with at least the negative effects of depriving women and girls of education, not necessarily the method of removing the Taliban. So they figured into the discourse in a certain way as a justification for the use of force. And Enloe thinks that's problematic. She says the starting point should be going in and talking to feminists within Afghanistan. We might be amazed to even know that there were feminists in Afghanistan, or there was an organization of feminist women working to try to direct the rebuilding and the reconstruction effort in their country. We kind of thought of them as, voiceless victims that we needed to go in and liberate and free and help. When in actual fact, some of them had been working within the country to try to bring about change and bring about greater recognition of women's rights and the need for education. So there's an unease with the way that women are constructed, and then a real kind of, she's imploring those who really care about the future of Afghanistan, if they want to improve the condition of women, and they truly want to help the women within that country, to find those women and listen to what they have to say. She says the starting point, if we really care about the issues of women in other countries and other places throughout the world, is to find those women and ask what is their perspective and what are their needs and what are their desires, what are their goals, which didn't necessarily happen in the case of Afghanistan. The rebuilding effort didn't necessarily single out these feminist groups and try to activate their voices and figure out how they could play a role in the rebuilding of the country, even though one of the justifications for the war was all the terrible things that the Taliban was doing to women. So we see the role that construction can play, right? Social construction of certain norms and assumptions, and in this case, the social construction of women and girls as these helpless victims, which we, the good civilized people of the wealthy Western world, need to go in and liberate. And then the importance of giving voice to the feminist perspective wherever it exists. And I think most feminist IR scholars would say it exists everywhere. There's never, women who are in a position of oppression who are not savvy and smart and trying to figure out ways to bring about change or to struggle against it. So it's wrong to assume that there are just kind of, helpless women out there that better, more civilized people need to go in and help. So that gives you just kind of a snapshot of feminist IR theory and the way that you can apply it in a given situation. That kind of wraps up our overview of the different theories. Feminist IR theory is the last major theoretical perspective that we look at, but I didn't want to just kind of wrap up there and then move on to substantive stuff. So I just have kind of a few pieces of advice and some suggestions for how to make sense of these competing perspectives. I've thrown a lot of different ways, different lenses through which to view international relations at you in a very short time span, and you might feel as if you're kind of swimming in all these different perspectives. Realism, liberalism, Marxism, constructivism, feminism, lots of isms that we've covered in a very short time span. So how do we use these things and how do we make sense of these different perspectives? I have a few pieces of advice. So the first piece of advice that I give is try to avoid, although this will be tempting, try to avoid choosing a single perspective through which to interpret all events in international relations. In other words, try to avoid saying, oh, I'm a realist. Rob Glover, or whatever your name is, I am a realist. That is the only lens through which I interpret events in international relations. I think a better strategy, particularly as you're learning about these things and getting a sense of how theory operates and what some of the major international issues are, is try to look at singular events through multiple lenses. There's an issue that you're interested in. You're really interested in a trade agreement that's in the news, or you're really interested in a particular conflict, right, that's going on in the world. Look at that event and learn about that event and do your research and read about it and create a Google alert and any new news story that comes out about that event, have it sent right to you, and learn as much as you can. And then try to interpret that event. Once you have that information and you've done that research, try to interpret that event through multiple lenses. Don't just say, oh, I'm a realist, so I'm going to look at the operations of power, and I'm going to assume that states are the most important actors. I'm going to assume that international organizations don't really have any independent power. And so when I use that set of assumptions, and I think that the world is, anarchic, there's no overarching power that can tell states what to do, this is the interpretation I get. Well, that's fine, right? But that means that you're using theory in a very limited way that might not actually increase your understanding of events and might not actually increase your ability to explain and interpret events. A better strategy is to interpret that singular event through multiple lenses. So you remember the video that we watched with Steve Smith, one of the authors of your book, in which he was looking at the Syrian civil war. He says, okay, here's how a realist would interpret it, and here's how a liberal would interpret it, and here's how a Marxist would interpret it, and so on and so on and so on. Try to do that. And that's what really pushes you out of your comfort zone, because it's easy to find the one theory that's kind of, simple and that you know the most about, and then to apply it over and over and over again to every international situation. And it's consistent, right? It means that you'll get more or less some version of the same perspective each time, but it's actually much more challenging, and it really engages your critical thinking quite a bit more to try to use multiple lenses, multiple perspectives to understand a single event. So that's what I encourage you to do. And in some of your exams and some of your subsequent assignments, that's specifically what I ask you to do. Here's an event, interpret it through a realist lens, interpret it through a liberal lens, interpret it through a Marxist lens. So that's my first piece of advice, how to use these different perspectives. Second piece of advice, some theoretical tools are more versatile than others, and you have to utilize theory strategically. So some perspectives don't really, they single in on certain things, right? And they don't really delve into others. Realists, for example, there's not really a lot of realist tools that you can use to analyze something like the environment, or something like international identity. It's not something that they're overly concerned about. Yet if you were to look at liberalism or constructivism or even Marxism, they can give you tools to analyze those sorts of questions. So try to adapt the theory that you're using to make sense of a certain event. Try to adapt it to the actual issue or the event that you're looking at. And some perspectives are going to be better than others. Some theoretical perspectives are going to have better tools to analyze specific events. That's another reason why it's important to avoid choosing a single perspective and then identifying only through that perspective. I'm only a realist, or I'm only a liberal. Because if you use this full range of theoretical tools, you'll be able to analyze more things in more depth. And then lastly, remain attentive to the details of cases. Theory, the absolute worst way that you can use theory is as a substitute for curiosity, investigation, and analysis, right? So if you say, well, I know the basic assumptions of liberalism, I can read this one AP story on what's happening in the EU right now, and then I don't have to do any follow-up, I don't have to do any analysis, I can just use the liberal perspective to offer an account or an explanation of what's happening that I'm pretty comfortable in because I have this basis in theory. Well, that's not the case. Theory doesn't mean that you don't have to go and learn a lot about a specific situation. Remember back to that first lecture on theory and the role of theory. It's to help you make sense of complexity. It's not to help you ignore complexity. You still have to be aware of all of the different minutiae of what's happening, but theory helps you make sense of it. Theory helps you take all of that information that might exist around a specific issue or event and start to parse it out and categorize it and begin to arrive at some sort of account of what's happening in the world. So we still have to do our homework, unfortunately, but theory can help us interpret these events and make sense of them. So that's my general advice. If you're struggling with the theory at all, or you want to chat about any of these things, please don't hesitate to contact me and we can kind of work through it. I know we've covered a lot of theory in a very short time span, but hopefully it's been clear, and hopefully the application of the theory has made clear to you some of the ways in which theory is used. But if anything's unclear, please don't hesitate to contact me. Okay. So we'll wrap up there. A few reminders for next time. Remember to post on the class discussion board by Saturday at 8 p.m. There are a few of you that your discussion post came in a little bit late last week, and some of you didn't post at all, but it's a really important way for me to get a sense of the extent to which you comprehend the material and what sorts of questions and issues you're thinking about in relation to the class. Also, you'll all have received from me the icons simulation information. So you have your country assignment and your personalized link to log in and set up your account. And you should do that if you haven't done so already. Go ahead and set up your account and start to review some of the materials that are available to you on the icons platform, your role sheet and some of the resources that are available there, and also just get a sense of kind of the layout of that platform and how to communicate, things like that. And if you have any questions, let me know. So if you haven't done that, if you haven't logged on to the Icons website, or if you haven't received that email from me, you should do so as soon as possible, or contact me if you haven't gotten that email. For next class, we're talking about foreign policy. So you're going to be reading Chapter 4 in the Lamy textbook. And as you do so, think about our foreign policy, United States foreign policy, or the foreign policy of any country, and consider what are the most important factors that influence a state's foreign policy. Is it the structure of the international system? Is it domestic factors like the state of their economy or the demands of their population, whether or not they have a democratic or a non-democratic regime, those sorts of domestic level factors? Is it personality based? Do leaders have different visions for what foreign policy ought to be, and does that influence what foreign policy eventually looks like? Or is it something else? Do you think that there's some other really key factor that isn't included here? So we're going to start talking about foreign policy next time and have those kind of questions and your tentative answers to those questions in the back of your head. Okay, we'll wrap up there. Thanks very much.